I'm on. Hey, how you doing? There's some weird stuff that I wanted to go over that I really liked that I thought was interesting. These are kind of weird subgenres that intersect with cartography, a frontier of understanding, a type of visualization. One thing that I got fixated on recently was things related to palmistry. We're a pattern-seeking animal. You do it, I do it. We look for patterns. What if it was as simple as the future and what lay ahead of you was in your own palm? Can you imagine that? So from 1915, a chart with the basic layout of what they're looking for. And it's all good news for this guy. I have another thing from the 30s. This gets into more detail. This is the palmograph. It's the ways to lead to success and what are characteristic. The interesting thing is it's not just your palms, it's the creases in your finger that will tell if you're tending towards religiosity. Fingernails, that kind of thing, or even hand shape. Some hand shapes apparently are more psychic than others. So I do have one of those. This is interesting because it's a strange mix of rights of inheritance and privilege meet the world of faith. And what we get is we get British Israelism. Basically, this chart shows us from George VI and Queen Elizabeth II, so we're somewhere in the 50s, all the way back through the House of David and all the way back to the patriarchs. It is a weird, convoluted, pseudo-psychological conspiracy theory, let's just call it that, that alludes to the privilege, the right, and the premise of the future belongs to you because of what you're inherited through. Another thing related to stuff of a different bent when it comes to culture and ethnicity, and I was very interested in this. This is Francis Walker, an important work from the 1870s, and many will argue it's the first major data-based study of themes, economic, other things along those lines in the country. This, a look at the colored population. So we're not that long after the end of the Civil War. This is done mid-1870s. And what becomes interesting is you see the concentrations of African Americans deep south, the central south, the eastern border. But when it comes to in the northern reaches, all of a sudden you start seeing concentrations around St. Louis, and you start to see like a depth of community starting to build in Chicago. Extrapolating much further on, this is a publication. We've handled many things from the Black Panther Party from the late 60s through the 70s. I think this is the earliest instance we've found yet. This is in January of 71. They found a map that Scanlan's was a kind of leftist newspaper, and they composed a map that took all the regional instances of bombings and any acts of rebellion, protests, all that kind of stuff, and condensed it into one map of the U.S. There's a classic quote from Quentin Hardy. He was at New York Times, now he's at Google, that between 68 to 71, there were 2,000 bombings in the U.S. It's a lot. And what might have been depicted on the news with Walter Cronkite or whomever might have felt a lot different from what you experienced at the time. And so it was illegal and wasn't supposed to be printed, but the Panthers did it anyway. And they printed this map in late January of 71. Changing topics altogether. I'm always fixated on music and how it gets this regional depictions and these concentrations. I had just this small thing from Cook that was part of a publication that they did in the 20s. But it was just interesting to me that when part of the great composers you kind of anticipate, they're going to be coming from Central Europe, you know, the Renaissance roots of Northern Italy, Paris, that kind of thing. And indeed, you look and lo and behold, Debussy, Bizet, Gounod, all these people are coming from Paris. But it's when you start looking further and all of a sudden you notice like Ravel in some small town in southwest France, or you notice Scarlatti in some town on the northern edge of Sicily, or probably the most telling is a small town just west of Warsaw, Chopin. So yeah, have one of those. This is an interesting extrapolation, and I could ramble on about this thing way too much. This is a country and Western music map by Thurston Moore, not Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth fame. There's another Thurston Moore that's his predecessor. What's great about this is it's all of the film stars of the time that contributed to the culture. So Gabby Hayes, Ken Curtis from Gunsmoke, local Colorado guy from down in Lamar. All those radio stations, the big ones, literally that went from coast to coast. The big one in Chicago, big one in New England. There's some on the West Coast. They're all playing the same kind of roots country music. It gets really interesting when you start looking, and of course, the Titans are there. So everybody from Bill Monroe to Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs. But what becomes really interesting is when you start looking at where people are originating from, even though they're seen as these stalwart archetypal characters of the industry. The classics were, Ray Price and Ferlin Husky and all those guys are there. The interesting one is when you look at people like Tex Williams. Tex Williams wasn't from Texas, he was from Central Illinois. Or you start looking at somebody like Slim Whitman, kind of a Western showy guy that kind of did it. He was from Central Florida. Or the most interesting one is Hank Snow, another stalwart kind of, you think of Roy Acuff type thing. He was from Nova Scotia. So what you begin to see is even though there's this concentration and this identity that happens, it sure ain't located just regionally because it's popping up all over the place. So yeah, 1954. And then a big jump. This is a map of U2's Dublin. U2 started out as a punk band in the scene there in the late 70s. They were The Hype, and there were they had a couple of other names prior to that. What they really are, though, in so many ways, is it would be hard to find another band that is such a product of its environment. Hard cast in the Troubles of the 80s and the late 70s in Ireland, and that whole thing of their constant striving for peace, for unity, for this thing of redemption and all this kind of stuff deep down, it becomes very obvious that this is kind of rooted in them and their struggle that was infused by where they came from. It's interesting, people have overlooked the fact that, I think it was in the early tours in America that people were throwing money and change on stage for U2 because they played a bunch of shows on the East Coast. And the expectation was U2 was using that money to funnel back to the IRA. That wasn't in them at all to do at any juncture. So here we get a geographical view of some of the components of what made U2 into U2. And then the big thing looming behind me is the final thing I wanted to chat about, which is indeed another great thing by the folks at Pop Charts. I think this was done 2010, something along those lines. But it is a massive map of hip-hop monikers. And so what we have is the entire scope of the musical genre, but just connected by hubs, little identity networks that perhaps you're a rapper that has a name that's related to wordplay or Prince's or anything along those lines. And so what you have is you have a span of going all the way from more recent rappers like Krayshawn, all the way back to Grandmaster Flash, MF Doom, everybody, Nipsey Hussle is shown present. But what you get to as well is you begin to see these certain nodes where all of a sudden you have a couple of different generations that are all circling around a similar identity. So literally you go from UTFO to EPMD to nerd. And what you begin to realize is there might be different styles. They might not even know about each other, which is epidemic, unfortunately. But what you have is this constant sense of they're not that far away from each other in some ways about how they think about themselves and their presence in the music industry. So that's a favorite. It's a limited edition thing. I think this is number 160 out of 500 and is signed. So just some weird stuff that I thought was cool. Hope you're doing well. Catch you guys soon. Wait. One more thing. I forgot one of my favorite things. Wind it back to the culture part. African-American heritage. I have a fantastic wall map done by Hearn Brothers, the big firm out of Detroit. And it is 4 maps in one. So it has the migration of African Americans in the US, Africans in the world, a map of African Americans in Nebraska, and then the verso is Africa. I think of this as the consummate Malcolm X map. If you recall, he was born just outside of Omaha. His father was a Garveyite and all that kind of stuff. So as you look over the map, it's a mid-1970s focus on African American culture, unlike was typical of the era. A fantastic and rare thing. Okay, I'll see you next time.